Hi. So this week we're talking about rabbis in the Beit Midrash. We can say we're focusing on the professional side of rabbinic life for the rabbis of late antiquity. And the focus of this presentation is really going to be on the civilizational change that we can chart over the course of the rabbinic period. So as you remember, when rabbis emerge, they emerge after the destruction of the Second Temple, and they're really based in the land of Israel, first in Yavne and then in Galilee, but they're living in a thoroughly Greco-Roman milieu. As the rabbinic period continues, alongside the center of rabbinic life in the Galilee, there emerges another center of rabbinic life in Babylonia, with the founding first of the yeshiva in Sura and then in Pumbedita. We have new centers of rabbinic life in Babylonia, and eventually the Babylonian center overtakes the Palestinian center. And it is those Babylonian rabbis whose lives are focused, as you can see, along the shores of the Euphrates, who become the real determiners of the shape of rabbinic Jewish life for the centuries following. Now, it's important to remember when we think about the rabbinic academies in which the rabbis do their work, that the Babylonian Talmud, which after all is the only source we have for rabbinic life in Babylonia, that we know it was edited rather late. And so even when you find a story in the Talmud about Palestinian Tanaim or Palestinian Amoraim, you always have to read that story through the filter of historical knowledge, because it might be that the editors, the late editors of the Talmud who are serving as your storytellers, are actually using the characters from earlier rabbinic history to express their own culture and values. And this will be something that we get to talk about more in class when we look at some rabbinic sources. So before we delve into talking about some of the particulars of what we would call Stammaitic culture, it's going to be helpful to review some basic terms. Beit Midrash, the house of study, is a general term that we use to talk about the spaces where rabbis do their work across the breadth of rabbinic life and across the breadth of Jewish history. So one thing that I hope you'll take away from this presentation is the idea that what that space looks like changes an awful lot in different places and in different times. We tend to talk about Babylonian rabbinic culture as emerging in a yeshiva. The Aramaic is Metifta, and you might find people talking about Mesivta in an Ashkenazi context. So the yeshiva, as a highly hierarchically structured institution where there's many teachers, but a strong sense of hierarchy that separates advanced or superior teachers from newer teachers, and more advanced students from less advanced students. That complicated structure, and even having a physical space with many people crowded in, seems to emerge only very late in the rabbinic period, probably after the Amoraic period. We know about it most directly from Geonim. And so when in Talmudic stories we have discussions of the yeshiva as being places where people sit in rows according to status, even if those stories are about early rabbis, probably they come out of the late period of the Stammaim. Remember, Stammaim is a new scholarly word invented within the last generation to speak about the generation of rabbis in Babylonia who can be credited with editing and really creating the Babylonian Talmud. And Stammaim is a name taken from the traditional term for the anonymous editorial voice in the Babylonian Talmud. That anonymous voice is traditionally known as the Stam. Before scholars invented this term Stammaim, the tradition was to speak about those generations of rabbis who lived in the 5th, 6th, beginning of the 7th century of the Common Era as the Saboraim, or the explainers, the first generations of rabbis, according to tradition, who were not creators of the Talmud, but interpreters of the Talmud. So the shift that scholars have made in contemporary times is to think about those generations as a time when the Talmud is still unfinished and coming into form. And so rather than talking about Saboraim as explainers of the Talmud, we think of the Stammaim as creators of the Talmud. Here's a few more important Aramaic terms that come up in the study of the Babylonian Talmud. The word shmata, based on the Hebrew shmu'ah, is a term for a transmitted tradition. It might be in the form of a Braita, which would be a Tannaitic tradition, or a Memra, and here as you see, a Memra is an Amoraic tradition that is passed down. The Aramaic term for the kind of legal dialectics which makes up so much of the Babylonian Talmud is shakla vitaria, which can be translated as a give and take of dialogue or dialectics, but actually literally it means take and give, shakla vitaria. And finally, I'll remind you that the Geonim are those rabbis who lived in the time of Islamic control of the areas in Babylonia, and eventually in the land of Israel as well, where rabbis functioned. So a quick review of what we can call Stam theory. There are two main scholars who can be credited with developing Stam theory. The first is David Weiss Halivni, who took a historical perspective and really examined where to place the emergence of the Babylonian Talmud in history. And then a second scholar named Shama Friedman, who's really contributed to that work and brought a revolutionary perspective in his own right, when he pointed out that you could use textual tools to distinguish between different layers of the Bavli. And so while his emphasis wasn't historical, the kind of evidence in the text that he pointed to allows folks like David Weiss Halivni and his students to posit something like a history of the development of the Babylonian Talmud. So some of the key features that Shama Friedman points to in distinguishing between different layers of the Bavli, and he doesn't anchor them in particular times. He doesn't give them years like David Weiss Halivni does, but he does say that by identifying the different layers, you can put things in order. You can know what comes first and what comes later. And so here are some of the keys to distinguishing between different layers. One can distinguish between traditions that are named and those that are anonymous. Is a tradition attributed to an Amora, in which case it's a Memra and it's named, or is it anonymous, attributed to the Stam? Another key component in distinguishing between layers is distinguishing between Hebrew and Aramaic. In general, Amoraic statements, like Tannaitic statements, are in Hebrew, but the Shakla Vitaria, the back and forth of the dialectical argumentation, tends to be in Aramaic. Finally, another distinguishing factor is apodictic statements versus dialectical argumentation. Apodictic statements are sort of short, pithy statements of law or of norms. And the dialectical argumentation, as you're getting familiar, are the longer explanations of reasoning in building an argument. So all of these things together allow scholars to posit a much later editing of the Bavli than people had traditionally understood. We now tend to think of the Bavli as a creation of the 7th century of the Common Era in Babylonia. And with that Stammaitic shift, with the shift from the Amoraic culture of earlier times to the to the Stammaim, there's some cultural components that scholars have pointed to. They suggest that in the time of the Moraim, it was much like the time of the Tanaim, and that rather than having really fully developed permanent institutions in space where you had rows of benches or chairs and these strong hierarchies. Through the Amoraic period, scholars suggest, really rabbis and their disciples came together in small circles where there would be an individual rabbi and a number of students rather than these really developed structures. Also, with the Stammaitic shift within the generation of the Stammaim, that's where you really have the rise of dialectical learning, of the back and forth that the Shakla Vitaria recapitulates. Scholars also point out that this emphasis on dialectical learning, on scholarly argumentation, is not limited to rabbis or to Jews alone, but that there's a larger culture of scholasticism emerging in this period. For example, Nisibis, which is north of the center of rabbinic life in Babylonia, is a center for Christian scholasticism, where you have these groups of scholars who come together for scholarly learning, for abstruse argumentation, where the details really matter, as they do for the rabbis. Another feature of the Stammaitic shift to these highly hierarchical institutions that stress dialectical learning and genius is a shame and honor culture, where your place in the hierarchy might depend on your ability to best a colleague in argumentation. And finally, another feature of the Stammaitic shift is it's really the culture of the Babylonian Talmud in this late period of the 6th, 7th, and beginning of the 8th century in Babylonia, where you see Talmud Torah, scholarly study, emerge as the ultimate Jewish pursuit. So for sure, earlier generations of rabbis have a strong value of learning, of scholarship, but there always is a push and pull in earlier rabbinic literature between study on the one hand and action and good deeds on the other. With the Stammaim, Talmud Torah, the scholarly pursuit, the elite pursuit of study in the academy, overtakes all other religious acts and becomes the most highly valued activity. And the rabbis, as the elites, become the most highly valued people, especially from the perspective of the rabbis themselves. So as we close, I'm going to invite you, as you think about rabbinic life in the classical period of the Tanaim and the Amoraim, to have a picture like this. This is an imagination of how the ancient Greek philosophers might have gathered disciples about them. But it's probably a pretty good picture of how someone like Jesus or a Tana or an Amora would have proceeded in teaching. And when we talk about the Beit Midrash, we're not necessarily talking about an institution of brick or mortar with desks and chairs, but rather we're talking about a circle that gathers around a great sage. It's only much later, probably in the Stammaitic period, that with the rise of the yeshiva, you have many students gathering in these highly hierarchical settings for big groups of learning from multiple rabbis at the same time. Thank you. I look forward to being together to study more together in our own Beit Midrash. All the best.